So, the Final Fantasy franchise has been around a long time. I fell in love with the game early on as an NES rental. I had gotten Dragon Warrior free through Nintendo Power, and I enjoyed it a lot, and I was very eager to find similar experiences. When I stumbled upon Final Fantasy, it was an amazing experience. The world, it's a lot larger than the world in Dragon Warrior. There's more people for me to control. There's more magic spells. You have more options for weapons, more options for armor. You can wear more armor and weapons at one time. So, what I'm trying to say is the word more is a perfect description, as it takes the RPG elements that came about in Dragon Warrior and it gives the player more. So that brings me to where we are now here in 2021. Square came out with the original Final Fantasy. Now they're known as Square Enix, and they've made another remaster of the game that made me a fan of the series. So this is called the Pixel Remaster. It came out on Android, iOS, and Steam, and one of the things that they've been saying about this Pixel Remaster is that it's an attempt to recapture the feel of the original game. So I want to do a deep dive on this remaster, and I want to ask just one question. Do we even need it? Is it really necessary? I love seeing the original Final Fantasy finally come out on Steam. I've bought them all on Steam. And 1 and 2 have been missing for so long. I love seeing them come out on Steam. But I really have to question, is this the best way of bringing this game out to Steam and re-releasing it for everyone else? So let's go back a bit to what I said about being an attempt to recapture the feeling of the original game. So the new remaster has taken the core gameplay of the original NES version, but they've not taken any of the new additions and changes included in the previous remaster. But they did change all the graphics and sprites and made it look really 16-bit. This game looks like it could have come directly from the Super Nintendo era of Final Fantasy games. So the problem here is that all those previous editions were all meaningful changes. They did nothing but add and improve to the original NES game. They did not detract from that original game in any way. I'm going to start with the new 16-bit look. It looks great. It's easily the best feature of this new version of Final Fantasy. That being said, it's not the first time this game got a new coat of paint. Way back on the PlayStation 1, they completely redid the graphics and with a totally new style, and they kept that new style. They later released it on the WonderSwan, and they pared it down a bit, but when it came out, the WonderSwan version was easily the best version of Final Fantasy, just because the PlayStation 1 remake had loading in between all the battles, and it really slowed down the game a lot. And the WonderSwan pared down the graphics a little bit, but the game was a lot faster. Then it came out for Game Boy Advance, and the Game Boy Advance added new dungeons and whatnot, and it improved the graphics a little bit off the WonderSwan. Then it came out for the PSP. I'm going to go over the PSP release later, but in short, fantastic release. And then finally it came out for Android and iOS. But for me, this new Pixel Remaster look, it's not a step forward. It's a step to the side. It's another look for these games. And there's nothing wrong with the look. I like the look. Personally, I think it does look better than the original, but it's an aesthetic detail. And some people will prefer the new look. Some people will prefer the old remasters with the way they looked. And some people still prefer the old NES sprites. So there's two big changes here that I want to talk about. The first change was removing content. Back when the Game Boy Advance version came out, we got new dungeons that unlocked as each of the 4 fiends were defeated. Now, the 4 fiends are your primary bosses in the game. In Final Fantasy 1, you're given 4 orbs that represent the 4 elements: water, air, fire, earth. And you're tasked with defeating 4 bosses to restore the light to these orbs. I'm not going to spoil the rest of the story or anything, but this you find out within the first 10-15 minutes of the game. So I'm not really spoiling anything there. But in the Game Boy Advance version, whenever these fiends were defeated, we also got an optional dungeon that unlocked with every fiend. And each of these dungeons gave the player to fight some enemies from later versions of Final Fantasy. Enemies from Final Fantasy 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And you get the chance to get unique items in these dungeons as well. Sometimes some of the loot in there was a little overpowered for where you were in the game, but, I mean, being overpowered was a cool way to grind, and like I said, these were completely optional. The PSP release even got a 5th extra dungeon. More loot, it had a wicked puzzle in it, and a very wild super boss at the end. And for some reason, these were all removed in a remaster. And I have to ask myself, why were these taken out? These dungeons were completely optional. You could totally play and beat the game without traversing through these dungeons, but they made a great way to expand the game after being the main quest. Or, in RPGs, there's something called level grinding, where you have to go through a lot of battles in order to level up your characters or to get enough gold to buy new equipment. And these dungeons were a great way to do level grinding without going through the same area over and over and over again. Instead of just walking on the main map back and forth, left and right, up and down, fighting the same enemies, you can go into one of these optional dungeons. You can battle your way through it, you can get some good XP, you can get some good loot. The entrances were all way off the beaten path of the main storyline. I mean, if you didn't want to go to the new dungeons, you didn't have to. Like, the first one, if I remember, you had to take a boat out to the middle of the ocean to find a cave. You didn't have to mess with it if you didn't want to. And, I mean, if they really wanted to keep the original experience, there could have just been a toggle switch in the options menu. Just turn the new dungeons on or off. Simple. So the second big change that they made was the magic system. The original game had what I'm going to call a magic charge system. If you've played Dungeons & Dragons, like a tabletop Dungeons & Dragons game, you're going to be very familiar with the magic charge system. In Final Fantasy, there's 8 levels of spells, and each level has a certain number of casts matching. It'll max out at 9 castings per level if you completely level up your character. So, a level 1 spell, you'll have 4 casts. But if you want to cast a level 4 spell, you'll have like 1 cast of it, depending on your level. But as you level up, those numbers will max out to 9. But you'll never have more casts of that. So if you cast Cure 1 and you use up all of your casts in level 1, you cannot cast any more level 1 spells until you rest at an inn. You can still cast your level 2, 3, or 4 if you have charges left, though. Now, later on in the series, this changed to what I call the magic point system, where instead of charges per level, your character has a certain number of magic points. Let's say you have 500 magic points. And then you have your spell list, and let's say Cure costs 4 magic points. You can keep casting Cure until you run out of magic points. But if you want to cast a different level 1 spell, like, let's say Fog. Let's say Fog costs 5 points. Well, you can go ahead and use magic points to cast Fog. So even if you cast a bunch of Cure, you can still go back and cast Fog. Using the magic charge system, if you cast Cure too many times, you can't cast Fog because you've only got so many charges for that level of spell casting. Now, the magic charge system, it works great for Dungeons & Dragons because the tabletop Dungeons & Dragon game, it doesn't really have a ton of battles. Yes, you do fight. That's a big part of the game. But it's more about, well, role-playing. You go through and you're playing that character and you're exploring this world. You do some exploration in console games too, but the console RPGs are much more about fighting battles and building your character up. So the problem is, if you're using a magic charge system, you find yourself holding on to your spells. You don't want to use them. You want to save them for when you really, really need them. You don't really do that as much with a magic point system because you're not as worried. You're worried about losing all your magic points. not about running out of a particular spell level. So because now you're hoarding all your spells, you're holding on to them when you really, really need them. So now your mages are more or less useless in most battles, other than those few times where you want them to cast those heavy hitting spells. Because a mage doesn't do a lot of damage. It's a magic user. They're hitting for like 20 damage, while your fighter class is hitting for 120. Now, I can see why they did the magic charge system, because early on it was a fit. It was working in Dungeons and Dragons, and it did sort of work for the first game, but then they made that improvement with the magic point system. And it was nothing but an improvement. Magic points wouldn't really work in tabletop Dungeons and Dragons because it's a lot of math to keep track of. Each spell has a certain number of points, and your character has a certain number of points. It's easier to be like, okay, I've got 9 spells for this level, 8 for this level, 7 for this level. But you don't have to worry about that in the video game, because the computer takes care of all of that for you. Your console will take care of all of that for you. So, in my opinion, these two changes by themselves make the game feel more like a regression than the progression. And I understand wanting to keep that original experience and to bring back that original experience, but there's an easier way to do this. The game came out on the NES. The cartridge still exists, and Square still has the rights to it. If someone wants that original experience, Square could have easily taken the original ROM for it, added controller support for Steam, touch support for mobile, release it. And there you go, there's your original experience right there. But there's an even better thing that Square could have done. So years back, Square did a remaster of this game for the Sony PSP. And the PSP experience, I'm going to come back to it now, it was amazing. They took the graphics from the PS1 and made all the sprites really sharp and really crisp. Tons of detail in the backgrounds. Stunning magic spell effects. Like, it felt like you were heavy hitting whenever you cast a spell. Whenever your black mage threw out a nuke, oh my god. Like, the screen just explodes in this huge flare. It was beautiful. It included all of the bonus content that was in the Game Boy Advance version. And then they went ahead and threw in an extra dungeon, too. The soundtrack was awesome. Like, the PSP, if you don't remember, it used the UMDs, which are like these tiny CDs in a case. That meant that your audio quality, though, was amazing on the PSP. And they took full advantage of it in the PSP remaster of Final Fantasy. That being said, the Pixel Remaster soundtrack, also very well done. It's really similar to the PSP soundtrack, but it feels almost like a remixed version of it. But what I'm trying to say is the PSP version blows away the Pixel version. So if Square would have taken the lazy way out, it would have been a better release. They could have taken that PSP version and packaged in that NES version as a selection where you could actually choose between the PSP version and the original. So you've got the best of both worlds. If you wanted to play the original version and get that original feel, it's there. If you want to enjoy the game with all the new enhancements, all the bonus content, it's there. And they could have even done what 343 Studios did with Halo Anniversary. I don't know if you guys remember that version of the game back in the 360, but you could push a button on the controller and you could switch between the Anniversary version of Halo and the new remastered version of Halo. Now imagine that with Final Fantasy, where you could hit a button and you're playing the Pixel Remaster. You hit that button and you go back to the NES version. Now, they'd have to do some coding to where you couldn't switch if you were in one of the bonus dungeons, and they'd have to do some math to switch between the magic point system and the magic charge system. Maybe drop the number of magic charges that are available per level, depending on how much MP your character had. That could have been done. Instead, they rebuilt the game entirely, which, not a bad idea, but what they built does not compare to the previous versions. It's like taking a truck that's got the massive V8 in it that's made for hauling stuff. You take that motor out and you put a 4-cylinder It doesn't compare to what they previously released. It's a lesser experience, and there's no reason for it. They literally already made a better version. They could have just re-released it instead of actually regressing. So, for players looking to play the original Final Fantasy, if they want to just drop some money and immediately play, the Pixel Remaster works. But the player's losing out on so much more. I would recommend go out and purchase a PSP version. You can find it for $20. If you need a PSP, you can find one for about $40. And let's say you do this, okay? All PSPs can be hacked with custom firmware, and they'll allow that game to be ripped and play it wherever you want. So there's a PSP emulator called PPSSPP. This emulator runs great on Android, so you can play the PSP version on your phone using touch controls, and it works great. And you can also use that same emulator on Windows and Linux, and it's also available in RetroArch as well, so you can play that game there too. And the save files are going to be the same. This is huge because that means you can keep your same game going whether you're on your phone or your PC. This feature is not in the Pixel Remaster. Even if you buy the game twice, you buy it in Android, you buy it in Steam, there's no way to copy your save files over to continue the same game on two different systems. So it's really unfortunate. They have cloud saving in the Android version. You can upload your game save to a cloud, but there's no way to download that game save on Steam. You can only download it back onto Android. So, closing this out, I love the Final Fantasy franchise, and the original game is great. The Pixel Remaster, even, is not a bad game by any means. However, there's better ways to play this classic game. Better ways actually released by the company that made the game. And the player is robbing themselves of an amazing experience in the sake of a quote-unquote original feel that's not original, because they've completely changed the graphic style to more of a 16-bit style. If you want to play the game with the original feel, go buy the NES version. You can find it for $20 on eBay. If you need hardware to play it, you can either get a cheap clone NES for $20 if the game will run fine on. If you want to run the ultimate version of the original game, go get a retro AVS. They're around $200. You can output HDMI. There's hardly any latency. It's an awesome way to play the old original experience. If you want to play it with all the bells and whistles, go get the PSP version. You've got all that bonus content on that PSP version, and it's absolutely amazing. And in between those, in the middle, we've got this new Pixel Remaster. It's not the old original version. It's not the version with all the bonus content and all the bells and whistles. It sits in between those areas. So to me, it feels unnecessary.